The chamber went silent the moment the verdict light turned red, and I felt every eye on the station turn toward me. I am Ethan Cole, and I was standing in the grand ring of the Concord Spire when the convocation of elder species passed judgment on my entire world. There was no warning bell, no dramatic pause. One moment the magistrates were murmuring among themselves in their layered, echoing voices, and the next, the presiding officer, a tall Krael named Vekrin Thas, rose from his seat and read the ruling aloud without blinking his 4 dark eyes. Humanity, he said, had been found guilty of reckless expansion, unauthorized exploration, and repeated defiance of the boundaries set by the convocation. Our fleets were to be dismantled. Our colonies beyond the agreed line were to be evacuated within 1 cycle. And if we refused, a corrective armada would be dispatched to enforce the ruling by any means required. Around me, the other human delegates went pale. Laura Bennett, our senior trade envoy, gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Behind her, a young aide from the Earth mission dropped his datapad, and the clatter of it hitting the floor was the only sound in the chamber for a long moment. I did not move. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked up at Vekrin Thas and felt something strange settle over me. It was not fear. It was not even anger. It was something closer to relief, the way a person feels when a plan they have waited years to see unfold finally begins to move. Vekrin noticed my expression, and for a creature who had spent decades studying our species, he still misread it completely. He tilted his narrow head and spoke directly to me, his translator device flattening the natural music of his voice into blunt, careful words. "You do not appear troubled, human. Do you understand what has just been decided?" "I understand perfectly," I told him. "I understand better than you do." A ripple of noise ran through the gallery behind us, other delegates from a dozen worlds leaning forward to watch the exchange. Siltharn, the Voss strategist who had spent the last 3 years arguing that humanity's fleet numbers proved we were no threat at all, uncoiled slightly from his seat and studied me with new interest. "Explain yourself," Vekrin said. I did not owe him an explanation, and under different circumstances I would have said nothing further. But something in me wanted him to sit with the truth for a while, before the truth arrived on its own. "You built this verdict on the ships you can count," I said. "On the colonies you can see, the weapons you have inspected, the treaties we signed, and the numbers we reported. You judged us the way you judge every species that has come before this convocation, by what is visible and what is declared." Vekrin's mandibles clicked together, a gesture I had learned meant irritation. "That is how judgment is made," he said, "on evidence." "Yes," I answered, "and we gave you exactly the evidence we wanted you to see." The chamber went quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. Siltharn's coils stiffened. Somewhere in the gallery, a low murmur of translated whispers passed between delegates who had suddenly stopped looking bored. Laura touched my arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan, what are you doing?" "I am finishing something that started before either of us was born," I told her, and I meant it. Vekrin descended 2 steps from the dais, closing the distance between us, until his shadow fell across the polished floor at my feet. He was tall enough that most delegates found the gesture intimidating. I had stood in rooms far more frightening than this one, though I did not say so. "You are suggesting deception," he said, "before this convocation. That is a serious accusation to level against your own government." "It is not an accusation," I said. "It is a confession, and I am only telling you now because it no longer matters whether you believe me." I watched something shift behind his 4 eyes, a calculation running that he did not yet have enough information to complete. Good. Let him run it. Let him spend the next few hours trying to reconcile decades of careful, patient reports with the sudden, quiet certainty in my voice. Siltharn spoke for the first time, his translated voice smooth and unbothered, though I noticed his coils had not relaxed since I began speaking. "Human bravado is well documented," he said. "Your species postures even when cornered. It is, if anything, further proof of your unpredictability, and further justification for this ruling. Believe what helps you sleep tonight, I said, and I did not say it unkindly. I said it the way you tell a child that the storm outside will pass by morning, because you already know it will, and there is no use arguing about it. The presiding officer called the session to order and reminded the chamber that the verdict was final and binding under convocation law, effective from the moment of announcement. Vecrin returned to his seat, though his eyes stayed on me for a long moment before he did. I did not stay to watch the rest of the proceedings. I excused myself, walked out through the tall arched doors of the Grand Ring, and made my way down the quiet corridor toward the Human Mission's private communication suite, my footsteps echoing off walls built by a species that had judged us wrong for as long as we had known them. Laura caught up to me halfway there, her heels clicking fast against the floor. "Ethan," she said, out of breath, "what was that? What do you know that I don't?" I stopped walking and turned to face her. She was a good envoy, sharp and dedicated, and she deserved honesty, even if the timing was not mine to choose. "Not everything," I said, "but enough to tell you that you should not be afraid of what happens next." "They just condemned our entire fleet," she said. "They are sending an armada." "I know," I said, and I felt myself almost smile. "Let them come." She stared at me like I had lost my mind, and for a moment I understood why. From where she stood, everything she had worked for was collapsing in a single afternoon. She did not have access to what I carried, the clearances that had been handed to very few people across 2 generations, information kept so quiet that even most of Earth's own government had only ever seen the smallest edges of it. I reached the communication suite, sealed the door behind me, and sat down at the console. My hands were steady as I input my access codes, layer after layer of encryption falling away until a single channel opened, routed through 5 relay points scattered across systems no alien sensor had ever mapped. The screen blinked once, then displayed a simple acknowledgement request, waiting for my authorization. I thought about the chamber I had just left, about Vecrin's 4 dark eyes and Siltharn's smooth, confident voice, about 100 alien delegates who had spent decades studying our declared fleet counts and our declared colonies and our declared technology, never once suspecting that declared was not the same as true. I thought about my grandfather, who had served in the earliest days after first contact, back when humanity's leaders made a decision that would shape everything that came after. I thought about every quiet shipyard hidden beneath ocean floors and carved into the dark side of asteroids, about every officer and engineer and pilot who had spent their whole careers building something the galaxy was never meant to see. I typed a single line and sent it. "They have made their decision. Let them." The reply came back almost instantly, 3 words from a voice I trusted more than almost any other in the galaxy. "Understood. Beginning Phase 1. I closed the channel and sat back in my chair, listening to the low hum of the station around me, a station built by species who believed they had already won a fight that, as far as they knew, had not yet even begun. Outside the sealed door, I could hear Laura pacing, still waiting for answers I was not yet permitted to give her. Soon enough, I thought, she would understand everything. Soon enough, so would the entire convocation. For now, I allowed myself one quiet moment before I had to return to the chamber and play my part a little longer, the calm diplomat from the small, harmless, defeated species, smiling politely while the galaxy congratulated itself on a victory it did not yet know it had never actually won. I straightened my jacket, opened the door, and walked back into the Grand Ring with the same steady, patient smile I had worn since the verdict was first read, because somewhere far beyond the reach of convocation sensors, the true answer to their judgment was already stirring awake. Laura fell into step beside me without a word, and together we walked back into a chamber full of species who thought they understood exactly what humanity was. They did not, and in 5 days, neither the Krael, nor the Voss, nor a single member of that convocation would ever look at a human delegate the same way again. But that story had not yet begun, not fully, and as I took my seat once more beneath the tall arches of the Grand Ring, I allowed myself to enjoy, just for a moment, the simple pleasure of knowing something no one else in that room did. The verdict stood. The Armada would launch. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, humanity was already smiling back. Vecren called the session back into order, and for the next hour, the chamber worked through the formalities that always followed a major ruling: the scheduling of enforcement timelines, the assignment of fleet commanders, the ceremonial reading of convocation law into the permanent record. I sat through all of it, with my hands folded and my expression pleasant, nodding when nodding was expected, offering no objection, because objection was never part of the plan. A delegate from a smaller member world, a soft-spoken amphibian named Orin, who had always treated the human mission with more courtesy than most, leaned toward me during a brief recess. "I am sorry," he said quietly, his translator struggling slightly with the emotion in his voice. "I did not vote for this. I know it will not matter, but I wanted you to hear it from someone." "Thank you, Orin," I said, and I meant it. "Whatever happens in the coming days, I will remember that you said so." He studied my face for a moment, clearly puzzled by how little grief he found there, then returned to his seat as the session resumed. By the time the Grand Ring finally emptied, the last of the alien delegations filing out through the tall arched doors in 2s and 3s, the artificial evening cycle of the Concord Spire had already begun, the great transparent dome above us dimming to simulate a sunset none of us could actually see. Laura waited for me near the entrance, arms crossed, patience clearly running thin. "You cannot keep doing this," she said, smiling at everyone while our entire fleet gets condemned. "People saw you in there, Ethan. They think you have already given up, or worse, that you know something the rest of us do not and refuse to share it." "Both are true in a way," I told her, and immediately regretted how unhelpful that sounded. She exhaled sharply and started walking, and I matched her pace down the long corridor that led back toward the human residential wing, past murals depicting 100 different homeworlds and the treaties that had bound them together under convocation law for longer than humanity had known the stars existed at all. "There is a briefing tonight," I told her finally, keeping my voice low even though the corridor was empty. "Full mission staff. You will understand more after that, I promise you." "Whose orders?" she asked. "Higher than mine," I said, and left it there. We reached the residential wing in silence, the weight of the day settling over both of us in very different ways. For Laura, it was the weight of uncertainty, of watching everything she believed about her own government come apart in the space of a single afternoon. For me, it was something else entirely, the strange, quiet weight of finally being allowed to stop pretending, even if only a little longer remained before the pretending would end for good. I paused at the junction where our corridors split, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "Get some rest if you can," I told her. "Tomorrow is going to be a very different kind of day." She did not smile back, not yet, but something in her expression had softened, just slightly, as though some small part of her had decided to trust me a little longer. I watched her go, then turned toward my own quarters, where a private terminal was already waiting with a queued message from Admiral Marcus Doyle, time-stamped only minutes after my earlier transmission had gone through. I did not open it right away. I stood at the wide observation window instead, looking out at the slow wheel of stars beyond the Concord Spire, at the distant, glittering edge of convocation space where somewhere, unseen and unannounced, an armada was already beginning to gather. They believed they were preparing to enforce a verdict. We had been preparing for this exact moment for a very long time. The briefing room aboard the human mission deck had no windows, no decoration, nothing that might reveal to a curious visitor how much thought had gone into keeping it plain. 12 chairs sat around a long steel table, and by the time I arrived, 10 of them were already filled with officers and analysts I recognized only by the weight of their reputations, not their faces, since most of them had spent their entire careers working far from public view. Admiral Marcus Doyle sat at the head of the table, and even through the grainy holographic feed connecting him from a command post somewhere inside Earth's solar system, his presence filled the room the way it always had, ever since he trained me 12 years earlier on a base that officially did not exist. "Close the door, Ethan," he said, before I had even fully stepped inside. "We do not have much time, and there is a great deal you and everyone else in this room needs to understand before tomorrow." I took the last open seat, and Laura slid in beside me a moment later, her earlier frustration replaced now by something closer to nervous focus. She had been summoned along with the rest of senior mission staff, which told me the Admiral intended this briefing to answer questions far beyond the ones I had been authorized to answer myself. Doyle waited until the door sealed, then activated a display above the table showing a simplified galactic map, the boundary line the convocation had drawn around human space glowing red, and beyond it, scattered points of light representing every world we had declared as our own. "What the convocation voted on today," he said, "was a picture of humanity that is almost entirely accurate. Every number they cited, every ship, every colony, every treaty violation, all of it is true. We do not deny any of it." "Then I do not understand," Laura said. "If it is all true, what is there left to know?" Doyle allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile, the same expression I had seen on his face years earlier the first time he explained our real mission to me. "They know the truth," he said. "What they do not know is that it is only half of it." He tapped a control and the display shifted, the map redrawing itself, this time showing a second layer beneath the first, dozens of new points appearing across human space and well beyond it, deep inside asteroid fields, hidden along the rocky floors of ocean worlds, tucked into the shadow of gas giants where sensor interference made deep scanning nearly impossible. "This is the part of the story that only a handful of people outside this room have ever been told," Doyle said. "When our species first made contact with the convocation, our leaders faced a choice. We could reveal everything we had, our full industrial capacity, our full military potential, and hope that honesty earned us fair treatment. Or we could show them exactly enough to seem manageable, and quietly build the rest somewhere they would never think to look. They chose the second option," I said, more for Laura's benefit than my own, since I had heard this story many times before. "They chose survival," Doyle corrected gently. "At the time, humanity had no allies among the stars, no leverage, no proof that any of these species would treat us fairly once they understood what we were capable of. Our leaders studied every conflict in convocation history they could get access to, and one pattern repeated itself again and again. Species that appeared too capable too quickly were contained, restricted, sometimes broken apart entirely before they could grow into a threat. Species that appeared weak were often ignored, underestimated, and left alone to develop quietly on the margins. "So we chose to look weak," Laura said slowly, understanding beginning to show on her face. "We chose to look exactly as strong as we needed to look, and not one measure stronger," Doyle said. "It meant decades of discipline. It meant funding real fleets for show while building far larger ones in secret. It meant training pilots and engineers who would spend their entire careers working on projects they could never mention to their own families. It meant losing good people along the way, worlds and outposts we let go undefended because defending them properly would have exposed capabilities we were not ready to reveal." The room had gone very quiet. I glanced around at the faces of officers who had clearly known pieces of this story already, and analysts who were hearing the full scope of it for the very first time, their expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and something closer to awe. "How long?" Laura asked. "How long has this been going on?" "Since before either of us was born," Doyle said, looking at her, then at me. longer than most of the people in this room have been alive. It began with the first generation after contact, and every generation since has carried it forward, a little further, a little deeper, always waiting for a moment, exactly like the one we are facing now. I thought of my grandfather again, a quiet man who had spent 30 years working at a facility he described to family only as an engineering post, never elaborating further, no matter how many times we asked as children. I thought of the long stretches of my own training, when Doyle had sent me to remote postings with no explanation, testing patience and discretion as much as skill, preparing me for a role I would not fully understand until I was much older. Doyle continued, walking us through details that most of the room had never been permitted to see before. The shipyards hidden beneath the ice of outer moons, built using construction methods that left almost no thermal signature for alien sensors calibrated to detect the kind of industrial heat their own shipbuilding produced. The dark matter shielding developed decades ago, originally as a scientific curiosity, later repurposed to mask entire fleets from long-range scanning. The so-called civilian cargo network that had, in truth, spent years quietly moving parts and personnel between facilities that officially did not exist on any convocation registry. We let them see a fleet built to a treaty we signed honestly, Doyle said. Every ship on that registry is real, every number accurate, but it represents perhaps a third of what we can actually field, and even that estimate is generous toward their side, not ours. A young analyst near the far end of the table finally spoke, her voice tight, with barely restrained disbelief. If this is true, sir, why did we let the verdict happen at all? Why sit through a trial where every argument was built on incomplete information? Could we not have simply shown them the truth from the beginning and avoided all of this entirely? Doyle's expression grew more serious than it had been the entire briefing. Because showing them the truth without also showing them our patience would have made us just as dangerous as anything a corrective armada could imagine, he said. There is a difference between being feared and being understood. We wanted the convocation to eventually understand what humanity is, not simply learn to fear us the way they fear a weapon they cannot yet control. That distinction matters more than most of you realize. I found myself thinking about Vecran's 4 dark eyes staring at me across the Grand Ring, about Siltharn's smooth, dismissive confidence, about 100 delegates who had spent years compiling reports on a version of humanity that was accurate only on the surface. They were not fools. They were simply working from a picture that had been carefully, deliberately incomplete since the very first handshake between our species and theirs. So what happens now? Laura asked. The Armada launches within days. Are we simply going to let it arrive and reveal everything at once? Doyle nodded slowly. That is exactly what we are going to do, he said, not as an act of aggression, but as a demonstration. We are not interested in destroying this Armada. We are interested in making sure that every species watching understands, without any doubt, that humanity was never the fragile, erratic threat they believed us to be. We want them to see the truth clearly enough that violence becomes unnecessary, not because we cannot fight, but because once they understand what they are actually facing, most of them will not want to. And if they still choose to fight anyway, someone else asked from further down the table. Then we will show them exactly why that would have been a mistake, Doyle said simply, and something in his voice told me he had turned that particular calculation over many times before ever making it a plan. The briefing continued for another hour, moving through logistics, timelines, and the specific role each division would play once the Armada crossed into range of our outer defense grid. I listened carefully, filling gaps in my own knowledge even after 12 years inside this program, understanding now just how much larger the picture truly was than even I had grasped. When the session finally ended and the holographic feed of Admiral Doyle faded from the room, Laura remained seated for a long moment, staring at the empty space where the display had shown fleets she never knew existed. All this time, she said quietly, more to herself than to me. All this time, I thought we were just barely holding on out here, negotiating from weakness, because that is what it looked like from where I was sitting. You were meant to think exactly that, I told her, as gently as I could. Most of Earth was meant to think that. It was never about deceiving you specifically. It was about making sure nothing in our public posture ever slipped, not even accidentally, not even through the honest confusion of someone who did not know the full truth. She looked at me for a long moment, working through something behind her eyes, and then, for the first time since the verdict had been announced, she allowed herself a small, tired laugh. "They really have no idea what is coming, do they?" she said. "No," I agreed, standing and offering her a hand up from her chair. "They really do not." Outside the briefing room, the corridors of the Concorde Spire had gone quiet with the artificial night cycle. Delegates from a dozen worlds retired to their quarters, unaware that the species they had just condemned was, at that very moment, beginning to move pieces into place across half a dozen star systems, pieces that had been waiting patiently, silently, for exactly this moment for longer than most of them had been alive. I walked Laura back to her quarters, said little more, and returned to my own room to find a second message waiting from Doyle, marked with a priority flag I had only seen used a handful of times in my career. "Phase 1 complete," it read. "Fleet mobilization confirmed across all sectors. Armada estimated to reach outer boundary in 5 days. Recommend full readiness of contingency sunrise by then." I read the message twice, then set the terminal down and looked once more out at the stars beyond my window, calm and unhurried, the way a person looks at a storm they have spent their entire life preparing for, and are, at long last, ready to meet. 5 days, I thought. 5 days until the galaxy finally saw what it had spent decades refusing to look at closely enough. I slept better that night than I had in months. 5 days passed faster than I expected, each one carrying its own quiet weight, and on the 6th morning I stood on the observation deck of the command ship Meridian, watching a wall of alien warships bleed into visible range at the edge of human space. There was no way to prepare fully for the sight of it, even for someone who had spent a career training for exactly this moment. The corrective armada stretched across my display in tight formation, hundreds of vessels drawn from a dozen member species of the Convocation, their hulls a patchwork of unfamiliar shapes and colors. Krael cruisers with jagged, insect-like plating, Voss battle spires coiled like frozen serpents, smaller support craft from worlds whose names I barely recognized, all of it moving forward with the calm, practiced confidence of a fleet that expected very little resistance. Captain Nathan Price stood beside me, arms folded, his eyes fixed on the same display. He had commanded the Meridian for 6 years, and in all that time I had never seen him look anything but composed, but even he allowed himself a low whistle at the size of the approaching force. "They brought everything," he said, "every ship they could spare, by the look of it. I suppose they wanted to make an impression." "They are about to receive one instead," I said. Behind us, the bridge crew moved through their stations with quiet efficiency, no raised voices, no scrambling, only the steady rhythm of officers who had rehearsed this exact sequence more times than any of them could count. It struck me, watching them work, how strange it was that the most important day in generations felt, from the inside, almost routine. Doyle's voice came through the command channel a moment later, calm and clear. "All stations, this is Fleet Command. Hold position. Do not power weapons until my direct order. Let them come to us." I understood the reasoning even before he explained it further in a private channel to senior officers a few minutes later. If we moved first, if so much as a single defense platform activated before the Armada was fully committed within range, it would hand the Convocation exactly the narrative they wanted, proof that humanity had been secretly arming itself in violation of every treaty we had signed. Instead, we would let them come deep enough that there could be no argument about who arrived with force and who simply revealed what had always quietly existed. The Armada crossed the outer boundary line without incident. their scanners sweeping across a defense grid that, by every reading available to them, showed exactly what our official registry had always claimed: a modest network of patrol ships and orbital stations, adequate for policing but nowhere near capable of resisting a force this size. I watched the tactical display update in real time as their formation tightened further, clearly preparing for what they believed would be a brief, one-sided engagement. Somewhere among those ships, I imagined Vekran Thas watching the same approach from a command vessel of his own, confident that within hours the matter would be settled and humanity's fleets would be nothing more than debris and surrender signals. "Range in 3 minutes," an officer called from the tactical station, her voice steady despite the tension building across the bridge. "Hold," Doyle's voice repeated over the channel. "Hold until my mark." I gripped the rail along the observation window and watched the massive shapes grow larger, individual ships beginning to resolve into visible detail even to the naked eye through the reinforced viewport. It was strange, standing there in that final stretch of quiet, knowing exactly what was about to happen while an entire armada bore down on us with no idea at all. "Range in 1 minute." "Hold position," Doyle said again, and something in his tone had shifted, not nervous, but focused, the voice of a man counting down the final seconds of a plan more than a decade in the making. I thought of my grandfather again in that last quiet stretch, of every engineer and pilot who had spent careers building toward a day they might never live to see. I thought of Laura, somewhere aboard a support vessel further back in the formation, watching this unfold from a station she had only truly understood the truth of 6 days earlier. "Mark," Doyle said. The change came all at once, and even knowing what to expect, the sight of it took my breath away. Across the outer defense line, dozens of what the Armada's sensors had registered as harmless asteroid fields shimmered and dissolved, revealing themselves as heavily armed defense platforms, their weapons already tracking targets with practiced precision. The so-called civilian cargo network, scattered throughout the approach corridor, split open along seams that had been engineered to look like natural hull wear, modular sections folding outward to reveal warships that had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. And far beyond the visible edge of the battle space, hidden shipyards buried inside the ice of outer moons began releasing fleet after fleet of vessels that had never once appeared on any convocation registry, ships built using technology the convocation had never seen, moving with a coordinated grace that spoke of decades spent preparing for this single moment. On the bridge of the Meridian, I heard more than one officer draw in a sharp breath, despite having rehearsed this exact reveal dozens of times in simulation. Seeing it happen for real, watching an entire hidden civilization of steel and starlight unfold across the display all at once, was something no simulation could ever fully prepare a person for. The Armada's formation broke almost immediately, ships scrambling to reassess a battle space that had, in the span of 90 seconds, transformed from a lopsided massacre into something closer to a standoff, if not an outright reversal. Alien commanders who had approached, expecting an easy correction, now found themselves surrounded on every side, their sensors flooding with contact reports faster than their crews could process them. "Communication request incoming. Priority channel," an officer called out. "It is Fleet Commander Thas." "Put him through," Doyle said. The main display shifted, and Vekran Thas appeared, no longer the composed magistrate who had read our verdict aloud in the calm surroundings of the Grand Ring, but a commander whose 4 dark eyes now carried something closer to alarm, his mandibles clicking rapidly as he processed the scene unfolding around his own fleet. "This is a violation," he said, his translated voice sharp and clipped. "Every ship registered under your treaty obligations was accounted for. This," he gestured, though the gesture did not translate cleanly through the feed, "this is a deception, on a scale that violates every agreement your species has ever signed with this convocation." I stepped forward into view of the channel, and I saw the moment Vecrin recognized me from the Grand Ring, his posture stiffening slightly. "We violated nothing," I said, keeping my voice level. "Every ship on our registry is exactly as declared. We never claimed those numbers represented the full extent of our capability, and if you review the treaty language carefully, you will find that we were never required to." "You allowed us to believe otherwise," he snapped. "We allowed you to draw your own conclusions," I corrected. "There is a difference, and I think, given a moment to consider it, you will recognize that difference matters a great deal under convocation law." Doyle's voice cut in, calm and measured, carrying an authority that filled the channel without needing to be raised. "Fleet Commander Thass, this is Admiral Marcus Doyle, Human Fleet Command. You are currently surrounded by a force more than 3 times the size of your own, positioned and ready. We have not fired a single shot, and it is not our intention to do so unless your forces initiate hostilities. I am asking you now, formally and on the record, to withdraw your armada and return this matter to the convocation for renegotiation." Vecrin's mandibles clicked several more times, a rapid, agitated rhythm I had come to associate with genuine distress rather than mere irritation. Around him, I could see other officers on his bridge, moving quickly between stations, no doubt relaying the same devastating tactical picture to command staff across the rest of the armada. "You expect me to simply retreat," he said. "To return home and explain to the convocation that the species we came to correct was, in fact, hiding a fleet larger than our own the entire time. I expect you to make the decision that keeps your crews alive," Doyle said simply. "What you tell the convocation afterward is entirely your own concern." For a long moment, Vecrin said nothing, his eyes flicking between the tactical display on his own bridge and the calm, unhurried faces looking back at him through the channel. I watched him weigh options I could only guess at, the political cost of retreat against the very real, immediate cost of a battle his own sensors now confirmed he could not win. Before he could answer, a new voice interrupted the channel, smooth and familiar, carrying none of Vecrin's rising panic. "This changes nothing," Siltharn said, his coiled form sliding into view on a secondary feed from what I assumed was his own battle spire somewhere within the formation. "Numbers alone do not decide outcomes. Our vessels carry technology your species has never encountered. I, for one, do not intend to retreat, simply because you have revealed a larger fleet than expected." Doyle's expression did not change, but I caught the faintest shift in his posture, the readiness of a man who had hoped for a peaceful resolution but had never once counted on receiving one without cost. "That is your choice to make, Commander," Doyle said. "I would ask you to consider it carefully before you make it." Siltharn did not respond with words. Instead, on the tactical display, I watched a cluster of Voss battle spires break formation, engines flaring as they surged forward on an intercept course toward the nearest human defense platform, weapons already charging. The bridge of the Meridian fell into a different kind of silence, the kind that settles over a room in the half-second before everyone understands, without needing to be told, that the next few minutes were about to become very dangerous indeed. Doyle's voice, when it came, was calm, almost gentle, the voice of a man who had hoped this moment would never arrive, but had never once doubted that it might. "All defense platforms," he said, "permission granted to engage incoming hostile vessels. Everyone else, hold your position and hold your fire unless directly threatened." Let us show them exactly why that was a mistake, and nothing more than that. I watched the display update as the Voss battle spires closed the distance, weapons flaring bright against the darkness of open space, and somewhere behind that calm, unhurried order from Admiral Doyle, I felt the first true pulse of adrenaline since the verdict had been read 6 days earlier, and the sense that everything we had built, everything we had hidden, everything we had waited decades to reveal, was about to be tested in the only way that would ever truly convince the rest of the galaxy. Not through words, not through treaties or verdicts read aloud in the calm surroundings of the Grand Ring. Through this. The first shots of the engagement lit up the tactical display seconds later, and across a dozen bridges throughout the human fleet, I imagined officers exhaling the same slow, steady breath I found myself taking, the breath of people who had spent their entire lives preparing for a single moment, now finally here. Vecran's voice returned to the channel, sharp with something close to desperation. "Siltharn, stand down," he said. "This is not the moment." But the battle spires did not slow, and on the display, our defense platforms began responding in kind, precise, measured fire that told a story of its own, not a desperate scramble to survive, but a controlled, practiced response from a force that had trained for exactly this scenario more times than anyone outside a handful of command staff would ever know. I gripped the rail of the observation deck and watched the first true test of everything humanity had built in secret unfold across the black, and for the first time since stepping into the Grand Ring 6 days earlier, I allowed the calm mask I had worn through every meeting, every briefing, every quiet conversation with Laura in the empty corridors of the Concord Spire to slip, just slightly, into something closer to the truth of what I actually felt. Not fear, not even satisfaction. Simply readiness, the readiness of a species that had waited a very long time to finally be seen. The engagement lasted 11 minutes, and by the end of it, every officer on the bridge of the Meridian understood that 11 minutes had been more than enough. I watched the tactical display with a kind of focused stillness I had not expected of myself, tracking the slow, steady collapse of Siltharn's attack as our defense platforms responded with precision that clearly startled even our own gunnery crews, who had trained against simulations for years but had never once tested those simulations against a living, breathing enemy. Shield arrays absorbed the first waves of Voss weapons fire without buckling. Counterstrikes found their marks with a consistency that spoke of targeting systems the Convocation had never encountered, technology built in secret over decades specifically for a moment like this one. 2 of Siltharn's battle spires lost power within the first 3 minutes, drifting dark and silent at the edge of the formation, their crews evacuating to escape pods rather than risk a fight they could no longer win. A third attempted a final desperate charge toward the nearest human platform, weapons overloading, in a last effort to inflict some measure of damage before the end, and I watched Captain Price give the order to intercept it cleanly, disabling its engines and weapons systems without destroying the vessel outright. Minimum necessary force, Doyle had instructed before the engagement even began. We are not here to prove we can kill them. We are here to prove we do not need to. By the 9th minute, Siltharn's remaining ships had gone still, weapons powered down, and by the 11th, his own voice returned to the command channel, stripped of the smooth confidence I remembered from the Grand Ring, replaced now with something far more careful. "Cease fire," he said. "My forces are standing down." Doyle's response came without hesitation, calm as it had been from the very first order of the day. "Confirmed," he said. "All human vessels, hold fire, allow Voss forces to withdraw and recover their disabled ships." I watched the tactical display settle into an uneasy stillness, the remainder of the armada frozen in place around a battle space that had, within the span of 11 minutes, completely rewritten every assumption the Convocation had ever made about the species they came to correct. Not a single human vessel had sustained significant damage, not a single human life had been lost, and an armada that arrived expecting an easy, one-sided correction now sat surrounded, its strongest advocate for aggression humbled in full view of every commander watching from every ship in the fleet. Vecran's voice returned to the main channel a few minutes later, and this time there was no attempt to disguise the shift in his tone. "Admiral Doyle," he said, "I would like to discuss terms." "I am listening," Doyle said simply. What followed was not the triumphant negotiation I might have imagined during years of training simulations, no gloating, no demands beyond what was necessary, no attempt to humiliate a fleet that had already been humbled enough by the simple, undeniable evidence surrounding them. Doyle laid out terms with the same calm patience he had used throughout the entire encounter, terms that had, I would later learn, been drafted and revised many times over the preceding years by strategists who understood that how this moment ended would shape humanity's place among the stars for generations to come. The corrective armada would withdraw from human space immediately, its ships permitted to depart without further engagement, provided no additional hostile action was taken. The convocation's verdict would be suspended pending a full renegotiation of humanity's status, to be conducted not as a defeated species pleading for leniency, but as an equal party presenting evidence the convocation had never previously possessed. And the matter of Siltharn's unauthorized attack would be addressed separately, through whatever internal process the Voss command structure required, since Doyle made it clear that humanity had no interest in dictating how another species disciplined its own officers. Vekrin listened to each point without interruption, and when Doyle finished, a long silence stretched across the channel before he finally spoke again. "You could have destroyed us," he said, and it was not quite a question. "We could have," Doyle agreed. "We chose not to, because destroying you would have proven nothing except that we were capable of violence, and violence was never the point of any of this." "Then what was the point?" Vekrin asked, and for the first time since I had met him in the Grand Ring, his voice carried something closer to genuine curiosity than judgment. I stepped forward again, drawn into the conversation without quite deciding to be, and answered before Doyle could. "The point was to be understood," I said. "You built a verdict on the version of us you were allowed to see, and you were not entirely wrong to trust that evidence, because in a sense we gave it to you deliberately. But understanding a species means seeing the whole of it, not just the parts it chooses to reveal on its own terms. Today, you saw the rest." Vekrin's 4 eyes studied me through the channel for a long moment, and I could not tell whether what I saw in his expression was resentment or something closer to the beginning of respect. "This will not be easily forgiven within the convocation," he said finally. "Many will call this deception a far greater crime than anything you were originally accused of." "Perhaps," Doyle said, "but it will also be very difficult for anyone within the convocation to argue, credibly, that humanity is erratic, developmentally unstable, or a threat that must be contained through force. We have just demonstrated exactly the opposite: restraint, discipline, and a level of preparation that took decades of patience most species in this galaxy do not appear to possess." Vekrin did not answer immediately. Instead, he issued a series of clipped orders to his own bridge crew, and moments later, across the tactical display, the vast bulk of the corrective armada began the slow, careful process of reorienting away from human space. Disabled vessels taken in tow, damaged battle spires recovering their scattered crews from escape pods still drifting silent in the dark. I watched them go with a strange mixture of relief and something quieter beneath it, an awareness that this was not truly an ending, only the closing of a single chapter in a story that would now begin unfolding on an entirely different scale. Doyle's voice came through a private channel a few minutes later, meant only for senior officers still monitoring the withdrawal. "Well done, everyone," he said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I heard something genuinely warm beneath the usual calm authority of his voice. "Today we did not win a battle. We ended one before it truly began, and that is a far harder thing to accomplish than any victory measured in wreckage." Captain Price exhaled slowly beside me, some of the tension finally leaving his shoulders as the last of the armada crossed back over the boundary line and out of weapons range. "I have trained for this scenario more times than I can count," he said quietly. "I still was not entirely ready for how it actually felt. None of us were," I admitted. Word of the engagement spread quickly through the fleet, and within hours, encrypted reports were already moving back toward Earth and outward across every human-held system, carrying news that would, I suspected, be remembered for as long as humanity continued to look up at the stars. Not a victory built on destruction, but one built on patience so complete that violence, when it finally came, lasted only 11 minutes before the side that started it chose to stop. I thought of Laura then, wondering how the news had reached her aboard the support vessel further back in the formation, wondering whether she felt now the way I had felt 6 days earlier in that sealed communication suite, the strange, quiet relief of finally understanding the full shape of something she had only ever seen in pieces. I did not have to wonder long. A message arrived on my private terminal less than an hour later, short and simple, and I read it twice before allowing myself to smile. "I understand now," it said. "All of it. Thank you for trusting me enough to let me see it happen, rather than simply being told." I set the terminal down and looked out once more at the slowly retreating shapes of the corrective armada, their running lights fading into the deep dark beyond the boundary line, carrying with them a story that would reach every corner of the convocation long before any official record could be filed. The battle, if it could even be called that, was over. What came next would decide everything. 3 weeks passed before the convocation reconvened to formally address what had happened at the boundary line, and in that time, the story of the encounter traveled further and faster than any official record could contain. By the time I stood once more beneath the tall arches of the Grand Ring, every delegate in that chamber had already heard some version of events, filtered through their own governments, their own analysts, their own private fears about what a species capable of such patience might do next. The chamber felt different this time. Fewer delegates murmured among themselves before the session began. Fewer eyes drifted toward datapads or private conversations. When I walked in beside Laura and the rest of the human delegation, I felt the weight of genuine attention settle over us in a way it never had during the earlier proceedings, and I understood, without needing to be told, that we were no longer simply being observed, we were being studied. Oren, the soft-spoken amphibian delegate who had quietly apologized to me weeks earlier, caught my eye from across the chamber and offered a small, respectful nod before the session opened. I returned it, grateful for the reminder that not every relationship built during this long, careful deception had been built on manipulation alone. Vekran Thas took his place at the presiding dais, and though his posture remained formal, something in his bearing had shifted since our last exchange through the command channel above the boundary line. He called the session to order, and the familiar hum of translated voices settled into silence. "We convene today," he said, "to address the events of 3 weeks past and to reconsider the verdict issued against the human delegation prior to those events. I will not pretend this is a comfortable matter for this convocation. We were misled, deliberately, over a period of decades, regarding the true extent of human capability. That deception, by any reasonable standard, represents a serious breach of the trust this body extends to its member species." A ripple of agreement moved through parts of the gallery, and I felt Laura tense slightly beside me, though I kept my own expression calm. "However," Vekran continued, and the chamber quieted again, "I have spent the past 3 weeks reviewing the treaty language humanity operated under since first contact, alongside representatives from a dozen member worlds. I have found no clause, no provision, no binding agreement that required humanity to disclose the full extent of its military or industrial capability at any point. They declared what they were required to declare, accurately, and nothing more. What we assumed beyond that declaration was our own conclusion, drawn without sufficient evidence and repeatedly presented to this body as though it were established fact." Siltharn, seated now with a visible reduction in the confident posture I remembered from earlier sessions, spoke without waiting to be formally recognized. "Regardless of treaty language," he said, his translated voice carrying less smoothness than before, "the effect of this deception was to place this convocation, and every member species within it, at a strategic disadvantage we did not consent to. That cannot simply be excused because it was, in the narrowest technical sense, permitted." I stepped forward before Vekran could respond, and I felt the full attention of the chamber shift toward me, the same way it had on the day the verdict was first read, though the atmosphere surrounding that attention had changed entirely. "May I address the chamber?" I asked, and Vecren, after a brief pause, gestured for me to continue. I looked around the grand ring, at faces belonging to a dozen species who had spent generations building a convocation meant to keep the peace among worlds that might otherwise have destroyed one another through fear and misunderstanding, and I chose my words carefully, aware that whatever I said in the next few minutes would likely be repeated and studied for years to come. "When my species first arrived among the stars," I said, "we found a galaxy already governed by rules written long before we existed, rules that had, more than once in recorded convocation history, been used to contain or diminish species that appeared to grow too quickly, too strangely, or too far outside the expectations of those already seated in this chamber. I do not say this to accuse anyone present today. I say it because it shaped every decision my species made from that very first contact forward. We chose caution," I continued. "We chose patience, because patience was the only strategy available to a species with no allies, no history among the stars, and no way of knowing whether honesty would be met with fairness or with fear. That choice cost us a great deal. It cost us worlds we could have defended more openly had we been willing to reveal capabilities we instead kept hidden. It cost entire generations of our people the simple freedom of living without a secret they were forbidden to speak of, even to their own families." I paused, and the chamber remained silent, waiting. "We are not proud of the deception itself," I said. "We are proud of the restraint we showed once the truth was finally revealed. When we could have destroyed an armada sent to correct us, we chose instead to demonstrate exactly enough force to end the conflict without a single life lost on either side, human or otherwise, apart from those who chose, against clear warning, to continue fighting regardless. That is not the behavior of a species this convocation should fear. It is, I believe, exactly the behavior this convocation should want from every member species it hopes to keep peace among." Vecren regarded me for a long moment before speaking again, and when he did, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before. "The convocation must now decide," he said, addressing the full chamber rather than me directly, "whether to treat this deception as an act of hostility deserving further sanction, or as evidence of a species that has, throughout its brief history among the stars, consistently chosen restraint over aggression, even when provided every justification and every capability to choose otherwise." The debate that followed lasted the better part of 2 full days, delegates from every member world weighing in with arguments both for and against renewed sanctions, and I sat through nearly all of it, speaking only when directly addressed, letting the weight of evidence speak more loudly than any single argument I might offer. Doyle's fleet remained visible at the boundary line throughout the proceedings, not as a threat, but as a quiet, undeniable reminder of exactly what those proceedings were actually deciding. On the final day, Vecren called the chamber to order one last time, and I felt Laura's hand find mine beneath the table as we waited for the ruling neither of us had been able to predict with certainty, despite everything we now understood about how this convocation weighed evidence. "By a clear majority," Vecren announced, "this convocation withdraws its previous verdict against humanity in full. Furthermore, this body formally acknowledges that humanity's declared military and industrial capacity, while accurate as stated, does not represent the entirety of what the species possesses, and recommends that all future negotiations with human representatives proceed on the understanding that humanity's true capabilities remain, and will likely continue to remain, larger than what is formally declared." A murmur ran through the chamber, not quite celebration, but something closer to a collective recalibration. 100 delegates quietly adjusting their understanding of exactly what kind of neighbor they now shared the galaxy with. Additionally, Vecren continued, this convocation extends a formal invitation to human representatives to participate in future proceedings, not as a species under observation, but as a full member with equal standing, equal voice, and equal responsibility in matters affecting this body as a whole. I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not realized was still tightly held, a tension built over years of training, over a lifetime spent watching my own government perform careful, calculated humility in front of species who had never once suspected the truth beneath it. Laura squeezed my hand, and beside her, the rest of the human delegation exchanged quiet, disbelieving glances, the kind of look shared by people who had trained for a battle and instead found themselves standing, unexpectedly, at the opening of something far larger and far more hopeful than any of them had truly allowed themselves to imagine. Vecren turned to address me directly one final time before closing the session, and something in his 4 dark eyes had settled into an expression I finally recognized. Not judgment, not suspicion, but the careful, measured respect one gives a rival who has proven themselves worth taking seriously. "You said, when I first read the verdict against your species, that you understood the decision better than I did," he said. "I did not understand what you meant at the time. I believe I understand now." "I hope you do," I said honestly. "And I hope this convocation understands as well, going forward, that humanity was never trying to hide from the galaxy out of weakness. We were simply waiting for the right moment to be seen clearly, and choosing carefully what that moment would look like when it finally arrived." Vecren inclined his head, a gesture I had learned over the years signified genuine respect among the Krael, reserved for very few outside their own species. "Then let us hope," he said, "that the next chapter of this relationship is built on clarity rather than caution, on both sides." I agreed, and the session closed not long after, the great chamber slowly emptying as delegates from a dozen worlds filed out through the tall arched doors, many of them pausing along the way to offer quiet words to members of the human delegation, words that ranged from cautious curiosity to genuine warmth, an entirely different atmosphere than the cold, distant judgment that had filled this same room only weeks earlier. Laura and I walked out together, and for the first time since the verdict had originally been read, I felt no need to hold my expression carefully in place, no calculated smile, no practiced calm. What I felt instead was simply relief, quiet and real, the kind that only comes after a burden carried for a very long time is finally set down. Outside the grand ring, beneath the great transparent dome of the Concord spire, Orin approached us once more, his translator carrying a note of genuine warmth this time rather than sympathy. "I confess," he said, "I did not expect to see this outcome when I offered my apology weeks ago. I am glad to have been wrong." "So am I told him, and I meant it completely." We spent the following days fielding requests from delegations across a dozen worlds, each eager to establish clearer, more direct relationships with human representatives now that the shape of our true standing in the galaxy had been so plainly revealed. Some approached with obvious caution, still uncertain how to regard a species capable of such long, patient deception. Others approached with something closer to eagerness, recognizing perhaps an opportunity to align themselves early with a power whose full potential the rest of the convocation had only just begun to understand. I thought often, during those days, of my grandfather, of the quiet decades he and so many others had spent building toward a moment none of them were guaranteed to live long enough to see. I thought of the engineers working beneath the ice of distant moons, the pilots who trained their entire careers for battles they hoped would never actually need to be fought, the generations of ordinary people across Earth who had lived their whole lives believing, honestly and without complaint, that humanity was simply doing its best to hold its place among the stars. They had all been part of something far larger than any of them individually understood, and now, at last, the truth of what they built together stood revealed before an entire galaxy, not as a threat meant to conquer, but as a quiet, patient promise finally kept. On my final evening aboard the Concord Spire, before returning briefly to Earth to help coordinate the new terms of humanity's standing within the convocation, I stood once more at the wide observation window near my quarters, looking out at the same slow wheel of stars I had watched on the night the verdict was first announced. Laura joined me there, saying nothing at first, simply standing beside me as the artificial evening cycle dimmed the great dome above us into something resembling a peaceful, star-scattered dusk. "Do you think they will trust us now?" she asked finally. "Trust takes longer than a single convocation ruling," I said, "but I think, for the first time since we first arrived among the stars, they finally understand exactly what kind of trust they are being asked to build." She was quiet for a moment, then smiled, small and genuine, the same smile I had first seen weeks earlier when she finally understood the full truth I had carried for so long without her. "They ordered our defeat," she said softly, echoing words that had passed between senior officers many times over the preceding weeks. And we only smiled. I looked out at the stars, thinking of everything that quiet smile had actually contained: decades of patience, generations of careful sacrifice, a species that had learned, long before it ever reached the stars, that the deepest strength often looks, from the outside, exactly like calm. We smiled, I agreed, because we already knew how the story would end. Far beyond the Concord spire, word of the convocation's reversed verdict was already spreading outward across 100 worlds, carried by ships and signals and the kind of quiet, unstoppable momentum that only comes when a galaxy finally, truly, understands who it has been sharing the stars with all along. And somewhere among those 100 worlds, in council chambers and command posts humanity had never even known existed, a new kind of attention was beginning to take root. Not fear, not suspicion, but the careful, deliberate respect reserved for a species the galaxy had finally learned never to underestimate again.